Dorothy might want to escape Oz and return back home, but I know a lot of audiences have been yearning for another escapist return back to the wonderful world of Oz. The first Wicked movie was a full-blown cultural phenomenon, and perhaps the most buzzworthy film of last year, for better or worse. And now Wicked for Good has arrived to conclude the story. Will it bring with it more infectious songs, or more controversies, or perhaps both? Is it good? Is it wicked? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So for those of you who remember my review of the first Wicked movie, you know that for the most part, I liked it. It was not without a few content areas, I think, for Christian audiences to think through and navigate, but it was a fun film exploring some interesting ideas and themes. And I will say that for the most part, Wicked for Good keeps the good times rolling. Well, I think it lacks the infectious songs and this upbeat energy of the first film. Wicked for Good is another immersive visual spectacle that may not be better, but I do think it arguably is a more emotional and thematically rich experience. Despite being originally conceived as merely part 1 and part 2, I think Wicked for Good feels more like a sequel than it does a continuation. It picks up the story after some time has passed since the gravity-defying ending of the first film, and it does have a slightly darker and more dramatic tone, if also slightly less fun. And in several ways, I think Wicked for Good is actually a superior film. I think whereas the first film at least sometimes felt like a parade of songs in need of a plot to string them together, Wicked for Good offers an engaging story, whether being supported by song or not. The film also ramps up the incredible visual spectacle in a way that seems destined to once again garner a lot of award consideration. It may be a musical, but it looks and feels like a full-blown fantasy epic. The beating heart of this story remains the relationship between Elphaba and Glinda, I think akin to something like Frodo and Sam in Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, and there is just something to me edifying about the elevation of wholesome and same-sex friendship, which is an on-screen relational dynamic that I know, especially Gen Z in particular, really desires to see more of. Now, depending on how perpetually online you are, you probably know that actresses Cynthia Erivo and Ariana Grande have been lightning rods for controversy, some of it warranted, but much of it not. But both, again, proved to be perfectly cast. I thought Ariana Grande really stole the first movie and earned herself an Academy Award nomination for her efforts along the way, and she remains excellent in this movie as well. But Wicked for Good allows Erivo to really shine. Obviously, her voice is angelic, but she also brings a more, I think, emotionally resonant and just vulnerable performance. On the other side, I think the areas where this film falters most, at least to me, is mostly a byproduct of either the source material or the decision to split this into 2 movies, because most of the best songs from the hit Broadway musical were seemingly included in the first film. The songs No Good Deed and For Good do leave an impression, I think, both in the singing and also the staging of the songs, but Wicked for Good feels just in sore need of at least a few more standout sing-along musical numbers. But the bigger issue to me is that the film also just feels a lot more rushed and restricted than the first film. I think perhaps similar to common criticisms of the modern MCU, the movie just constantly feels burdened by the need to connect all the dots to the story elements of the original Wizard of Oz tale, rather than developing its own characters or further exploring the world. Intriguing characters like Nessa Rose, which is Elphaba's sister, and Bach feel reduced to mere cogs of a necessary plot, rather than the vibrant characters they were in the first film. I think even the central Elphaba-Glinda dynamic does feel shortchanged at times. Now, this is not my first rodeo, so I know that, with a provocative title like Wicked for Good, and a continuation of the revisionist approach that redeems a notoriously evil witch, some Christian audiences are likely concerned or even opposed to this film just at a conceptual level. And some of the tension points from the first film do remain here. For example, there are several dramatic scenes where Elphaba conducts spells from a magic book called the Grimoire, and Christians who feel uneasy about fictionalized magic, particularly when it's done by a protagonist, will probably be better off skipping this return to Oz. In other ways, though, I actually think Wicked for Good is less problematic than its predecessor. Yes, the lead up, an implied sexual encounter between 2 characters definitely pushes the upper limits of a PG rating, but the prominence of just sexuality and sexual identity is much less overt this time around. Also, and I'll touch on this a bit more in the theme section, but the first film largely just blamed society for the existence of evil, with its iconic line, "Are people born wicked, or do they have wickedness thrust upon them. In contrast, the sequel, I think, takes a more nuanced perspective on just personal moral responsibility that I do think better aligns with a Christian worldview. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, really not a whole lot. Language, nothing for that, except for maybe a couple like kind of placeholder silly words in the place of profanity. Violence, nothing other than like sort of harmless action and fighting. For sexuality, this is where perhaps there is the most. Because like I mentioned, you do have a scene where two characters sort of modestly undress their, at least their like outmost garments, and climb into bed together, with one expressing that she feels wicked. And then they kind of scene cuts and they wake up in bed together with the man bare chested. The only other kind of things for that is there is a minor character from carried over from the first film who is clearly a gay character, and it could be said just like the general male population of Oz is generally more like flamboyant. As far as themes, kind of worldview, things going on beneath the surface, both Wicked films to me have explored just the nature of good and evil, but they haven't really done so in the same way. In this film, in the song Wonderful, the wizard sings, "Where I'm from, we believe all sorts of things that aren't true. We call it history. There are precious few at ease with moral ambiguities, so we act as though they don't exist." And obviously, I think some Christians may get a little squeamish about whether he's lumping in like religion into that declaration, but I think it's also important to note that he's wrong, and much of this film is Elphaba kind of fighting back against his relativist kind of thinking and affirming that there is an absolute standard of good and evil, even if God does not enter the picture to like establish that standard. The first film operated under the premise that like people are fundamentally good and innocent, only to have like wickedness thrust upon them by like, a corrupt society. It was a film, therefore, about like pushing for societal reform rather than for internal growth. In contrast, Wicked for Good, I think, more closely aligns with like Christian theology, showcasing that people are naturally prone to selfishness, and we must strive to like overcome our sinful nature and like pursue goodness. Even Elphaba, who was largely like a blameless heroine in the first film, demonstrates like an imperfect character, tempted to give in to like her hurt and anger, and finally become the wicked witch that the world sees her as. And in both films, like the citizens of Oz are just obsessed with labeling good and evil, even if they struggle to like actually discern it. And this film, I think, affirms that like, only our actions reveal the true good or evil in our hearts. Even Elphaba questions herself at one point, singing, "Was I really seeking good or just seeking attention?" Eventually, she challenges Galinda with what I think to be perhaps the best quote of the film, saying, "Good can't just be a word, it has to mean something. Goodness is not just about sort of titles or like public reverence, but about action." And in the end, Elphaba kind of embraces the wicked label, not as a way to like accept evil, but just as a sign of like no longer caring about the way the world sees her as, and a belief that like good actions aren't just done for public validation or applause. And obviously, any exploration of morality without God is incomplete, but I think this message of sort of selfless sacrifice and love is a wholesome and positive message that Christians can affirm. So overall, I think Wicked for Good may not be quite as like fun or vibrant as Wicked, but it does offer, I think, a satisfying and more like dramatic conclusion to the tale. If the first film felt like a product of its time, kind of a glimpse into the pervading values of today, for better or worse, then Wicked for Good feels more timeless to me, a modern myth about the internal struggle of good and evil. And at the end of the film, the characters question the difference between better and good, and I think whether this sequel is better is debatable, but it certainly is good, and I think good is probably enough for most audiences. But hey, I would love to hear what you guys think. This is probably going to be a film that has divisive opinions, so be respectful, but jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done so too, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider. Got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. We'd love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.